Good afternoon, everybody, and lovely to be with you as we do a daily Maverick launch of a delightful book, Joining the Dots. So I'd always wanted to know more about the politician Pravin Gordhan. As a journalist covering him, I must say I found him difficult to know. And then through these years, as he's become more prominent in our public life, my curiosity was really piqued. So it was wonderful when this book landed, and I'm very excited to be with the authors today, Jonathan Ancer, Chris Whitfield. Very welcome, and congratulations on a fine read, and one that's also quite easy to read. It's not a tome, it's not 700 words. It is an unauthorized biography of Pravin Gordhan. So I thought we'd kick right in, guys, and we will read from the book. Tell me, who is Pravin Gordhan? We know him as the Public Enterprises Minister today, but in fact, he's got a layered history in our country.
Jonathan and I are going to have to decide who answers which question. He has got an extraordinary history. He's I think, an extraordinary person. His life has been devoted to this country and improving the lot of South Africans across the board. He himself, he describes himself as an activist, and he doesn't describe himself as a politician. And in essence, I think that really is what he is. And at his age now, he's still in the cabinet. He's still trying to do the right thing for South Africa. And that's what he is, an activist.
So Chris, he doesn't, even till today, I have noticed he still describes himself as activist, never member of the cabinet, never politician. How does that show itself? How does that show up in what he does and how he is?
I think that's the sort of guiding principle of his life, is that he, as an activist, you have a cause, and his cause, broadly speaking, is to better the country for all of its people. And I think that everything he does is with that objective in mind. I mean, you might disagree with his methods, but his objective, I think, is a very honourable one, and that's how it manifests itself.
In fact, Ferial,
yes, Jonathan.
The question you asked, who is Pravin Gordhan, was the question that we asked all the people that we interviewed.
Yes.
And it came across very strongly that, from the time he was a university student, he was focused on this idea of the higher purpose, working for the community. And a very telling quote was from somebody that he worked with at SARS, Peter Richard,
yes,
who said, whatever Pravin Gordhan does is in the interests of the country. It's never in his own interests. And I think that really does sum him up, this idea of a higher purpose.
So because I guess that I've known him since I started covering him as more as from the negotiations era. In fact, you go much further back to when he started, when he came to consciousness in Durban as an activist. What kind of family was he from? Was he from a struggle family, or deeply engaged in the growing resistance of the time, or how did he come to political consciousness?
In fact, it wasn't from a struggle family, and he said to us quite wryly, he was the black sheep of the family. It was a very working class family. His parents had come from India. His father had set up a sari shop, selling saris in Durban, and they weren't well off at all. In fact, I think his father's business went under. It had been doing well, and then there was some sort of bad financial times, and he himself only started becoming aware when he went to school, and he met there were some teachers who talked a little bit beyond the school syllabus and delved into philosophy and literature. But it was really at university that I think his political consciousness started to develop. But he came from
So you came from a trading family.
Yeah.
So I guess in that kind of family, it's he would have been expected to take over the reins of the sari shop, kind of build the business, etc. And yet his path was different. So it was a teacher, a conscious teacher, and then I think he went to the University of Durban, Westfield, to study pharmacy. Jonathan or Chris, you can just jump in. Is that where he met all his activist comrades with whom he has stayed quite close to? If the book is an indication of that, could you tell us more about that time?
Yes, yeah. So I wrote that chapter, so maybe I should speak on that. But
yes,
it was at university, and a little bit after university, when there were a group of for me, this was one of the most amazing revelations of doing all this research. These activists in the 70s in Natal, who really were courageous, and they started to develop this idea of mass mobilization. And it started with the floods of the Mgeni River flooded its bank in the mid-70s, and it flooded a community that was called the Tin Town, and Pravin and these group of comrades went into the community to provide some social relief. And then they realized that by actually providing this relief, they can build people's consciousness. And this is where they started to develop this idea of mass mobilization. And there were a group of his comrades from the 70s that they then went into kind of the ANC underground together, and worked together all these years, and pop up all over the place. But it really was that era of the 70s of the activists in Natal, I think is something that I didn't know much about, and I think it's quite a remarkable chapter in our history that I believe we should know more about, the people like Sunny Singh and those activists.
That's really lovely. I must say, I wanted to just read the recent part, like, what did he think when Jacob Zuma fired him, and what is he thinking about how awful corruption still is today? And that's the tenor of a lot of our questions, but I was fascinated by the early period. So I just want to say hello to some people who've joined us, and then we'll read from the book. We've got 373 guests with us. Very welcome, Jill Tyson, Doreen Morris, Veronica Umputing from Pretoria, Louis van Brunswick, Anne Brown, Annie Camden, Dennis Bailey, many questions. Faisal Bayat, I promise I'll get to them. Rebecca Davis on the line too. And let's go straight to Bex's question. Hi guys, I'm curious to what degree this book is unauthorized. Sounds like PG, Pravin Gordhan, cooperated with the interviews. Chris, you want to take that one?
Yes, it is. It was unauthorized in that he had been asked, would he do a biography by the publisher, an autobiography, and he said no. And then they approached us, and we said, okay, we'll do the research, and we will write this book about him. But it would be whether he cooperated or not. So he chose to cooperate after lots of persuasion. And we spent more than 8 hours chatting to him. And so he was very positive about it. He encouraged people to talk to us, other people who he knew and who we were trying to get hold of. So he did cooperate, but we wanted to make the point that it was unauthorized, in that he never saw what we wrote. He never dictated to us what he thought we should or shouldn't concentrate on. And to this day, we don't know whether he's read the book, but he never saw the content that we came up with. It was our book. We approached it as an exercise in trying to get to understand this man.
Thank you. So we're going to ask Jonathan to read a passage for us, and this too he's chosen himself. So please do, Jonathan. Thank you.
Yeah. The wheels had just touched the tarmac at Heathrow Airport early on that Monday morning in 2017, when Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan, often called PG by those close to him, switched on his cell phone. The South African economy was underperforming, and he was at the start of a prearranged high-profile roadshow to the United Kingdom and the United States to promote the country as an investment destination. As the aircraft taxied from the runway to the terminal, his phone pinged. There was a message from Cassius Lubisi, the Director General in the Presidency, whose job it was to carry communications between the President and the various heads of government departments. What now? Gordhan thought as he opened the message. To Honourable Minister Pravin Gordhan, Honourable Deputy Minister Mcebisi Jonas, Director General Lungisa Fuzile, from Cassius Lubisi, Director General in the Presidency. Date 26th of March 2017, 22 hours 13. Good evening, Honourable Minister and Honourable Deputy Minister. By order of His Excellency the President, I have been directed to communicate an urgent message to your good selves that the permission for you to travel to the UK and the USA from 26th to 31st of March 2017 has been rescinded with immediate effect. In that regard, His Excellency has directed that I request that your good selves return to the Republic of South Africa as soon as you receive this message. Further, His Excellency has directed that you instruct Lungisa Fuzile to accompany your good selves back home. His Excellency, the President, will be dispatching a formal directive to your respective offices tomorrow morning, the 27th of March 2017. Gordhan disembarked into a crisp spring London morning, wondering what the sudden recall was all about. Since his reappointment as Finance Minister 15 months earlier, he had been under attack from all quarters. He had been set upon by the crime-busting unit, the Hawks, and the National Prosecuting Authority, which had thrown spurious corruption charges at him. The relentless pressure was taking a toll on his health, but at this stage, almost a decade into the presidency of His Excellency, Gordhan had no illusions about the sheer depth and width of the corruption that was tearing the country to pieces, and he was determined to fight it. It was no secret that he was engaged in political warfare with President Jacob Zuma, his former struggle comrade, with whom he shared a birthday, and the man at the center of the state capture project. Gordhan spotted Lungisa Fuzile and showed him the message. The two men stood in the airport, considering what to do. When the President instructs you to return immediately, you do so, but there was no immediate flight from London. They decided to continue with the meetings for that day, including two with Global Ratings Agency and a teleconference call with a third ratings agency. It was 6 a.m. and the delegation had been flying for 12 hours. Gordhan made his way to a hotel, showered, changed, bolted down some breakfast, and took a call from his deputy, Mcebisi Jonas, who was to head up the second leg of the investor roadshow to the United States, and was at that stage still in South Africa. He had also received the text message and wanted to know what was going on. I don't know, Gordhan told him. Maybe he's going to fire us now, said Jonas. Maybe, Gordhan responded. We'll see. By 8:30 a.m., Gordhan was in his first meeting. A little more than 24 hours after Gordhan had touched down in London and read the text message ordering him to return home, the wheels of the plane bringing him back to South Africa raised smoke on the tarmac at Johannesburg's O.R. Tambo International Airport, delivering the finance minister into a political firestorm.
Thank you very much. Just your reading that and my reading it earlier gave me grille or goosebumps, because it took you right back to that period of high state capture and of how this relationship of two comrades, the former President Jacob Zuma and Pravin Gordhan, completely frayed. Earlier in the book, you tell how that relationship started. Could either of you say, what did Gordhan do after that? And how did he use those struggle tactics of mass mobilization that he had come to as a young man to try and fight this encroaching corruption?
Jonathan.
Chris, Jonathan, whoever.
Jonathan, that's your chapter.
Well, so yeah, I think it's, let me think. I think when he was appointed as finance minister the first time around, and
yes.
The questions that we wanted to know is when did you realize that Jacob Zuma wasn't the comrade that you grew up with in the 70s?
Yes.
And he spoke a little bit about their relationship in the 70s, about how they'd worked together, and his unit, the Providence, had actually worked, had taken Jacob Zuma. Pravin himself had given Jacob Zuma money. In fact, it was probably money that he had used to get out of the country. And then even after Zuma had gone into exile, they had some contact in the ANC underground. And so we were quite curious about, well, when did you realize that Jacob Zuma wasn't the same person? And he talks us through that at the point. He said, the rot was beginning to show, but it was when he was called into a meeting to discuss the nuclear project that he realized that things had gone too far. And so what he did then was he did everything by the book. He made sure that it went through the process that had been set up. And in fact, it was because he went through this bureaucracy that the nuclear deal wasn't pushed through at that point. And we spoke to somebody who said to us, the country owes him a debt of gratitude.
A 1 trillion rand debt of gratitude. That's what they wanted to sign for.
Yeah.
So though reading it was insight into, and some of it was at the Zondo Commission as well, that he just rolled boulders into the way of this nuclear deal. That I think cost him a lot. So Chris, the book captures all of his many political and he's largely his political personalities. There's the political activist, there's the negotiator at the World Trade Center, the tax man who actually made us feel grand about paying taxes. I don't anymore because it gets stolen so often. The beleaguered finance minister fighting from inside, and then the builder of this kind of post-state capture landscape. I'm not even sure if it is post-state capture. Is that about right for how the book was written, each part of his life?
Yes, Ferial, we set off initially to look at his life chronologically, and we realized very quickly that if we were going to write that sort of book, it would be several volumes.
Right.
There are several book opportunities in this book alone. So what we did is from our interviews, we picked the parts of his life that we thought had been the most significant and where he'd played the biggest role. And we effectively wrote essays on that part of his life. It is broadly chronological, but there are also spaces in it. But what you identified there are the key moments in his life, the big moments where he played a role in changing this country.
I suppose what struck me is that at each of those roles, he defines a concept that we may now know very well, but that we don't necessarily attribute to him. So, for example, mass mobilization, as opposed to only an armed struggle that attacks your enemy and gets them out that way. He was part of the group which began to roll out that as a form of struggle. Then, as a negotiator, he's credited by other people, not himself, with developing the concept of sufficient consensus as a way of moving your negotiations forward. At SARS, he develops the idea of the higher purpose to engage the staff so that they see themselves as more than just tax collectors. Is that correct? And also, what was interesting to me is that he didn't really take credit for that. Those attributes come from other people who you interview. Is that right, Jonathan?
Absolutely. He was always very reluctant. I think there were only two places that he took credit for, and one was this acronym that he came up with Chris, do you remember the acronym? Mobilizing, organizing. He was very proud of that. And then the other thing, it was people had said that he's sort of both a micromanager and a macro manager. And he was also quite proud of that he can get into those small details, but also see the big picture. But he was very reluctant. He spoke about, we as activists, the group, he didn't take credit for anything.
That's really interesting. So he gave you 8 hours of his time. How did that go? Because it's COVID. You couldn't sit down with him and see his body language or get to know him. Was that a tough ask?
No. He's very personable. We spoke on Zoom and found him to be very easy to talk to, very personable, and very frank. The overwhelming sentiment that I was left with after talking to him was this: here's a guy who's not trying to hide anything. You could ask him any question, he'd respond. He sometimes gets a little bit testy. There was some criticism of him being a micromanager, and he responded quite strongly to that. But generally, very, very pleasant and easy and frank. And he knows what he's talking about. So every word he utters is measured and means something.
Jonathan, what was your? How did you come away from that?
Yeah, he spoke a lot, and his memory was incredible. His recollection of details from 50 years ago in the early 70s. I found it quite inspiring. There was one day that we had a long session, about 2 hours. I think it was on a public holiday, and he had been to he had just come from a cabinet meeting. Then he had a 2-hour session with us, and I think we hadn't done anything all day. But I came out of that session exhausted, and he was still going on to another meeting.
Gosh,
he really does work hard, and he's in his early 70s now. And he shows no sign of
letting up.
Yeah.
So we have lots and lots of questions, and I'm going to go to them. There's one that comes up many, many times. People obviously like him, or he resonates with people. But here's one from Herman Funk, and I can read you a few. The corruption today is even more vile than under Zuma, considering the PPE and other similar scandals. How can PG, Pravin Gordhan, stay with the government? Is the book an excuses supporters account of the indefensible? And Brown, Pope Francis said recently, unfortunately, corruption's a recurring story. It repeats itself. Then someone comes to clean it up, but then it starts again. And you wait for someone to come and put an end to this deformity. I guess the question, is he that guy? Can he stop that deformity? Shabadin Romani says he's called Jamnadas, that's his second name, but it's often used pejoratively by the EFF. Is it preventing him now from really standing up because he might be seen to be anti-black? And it goes on that way. Rose Sanderson, if PG is so concerned about doing something good for the people, then has he had blinkers on all these years? How could he wholeheartedly support ETOs? So many people saying he needs to step out of the ANC if he is to come into himself and be a genuine anti-corruption fighter. I must say I watched at the January 8th gathering last year, or actually before last year, straight after the Nasrec conference. The ANC people were all kind of streaming into the stadium. And there he was, lined up just ahead of Mosebenzi Zwane, then mines minister, or he had just been axed by then. But there were these two faces of the ANC. Do you think that, how does he reconcile still being in the ANC? Did that come up, or do you get a sense that it really is a part of his DNA now?
His wife talked to us about that.
Yes.
And about the disappointment that they and other activists of that generation felt about people who'd become rotten, effectively. And the broader context, I think, for him was that he could leave the ANC and try and change from outside, or stay inside and try and influence events there. And for example, he was one of the people who campaigned very vigorously for Cyril Ramaphosa to get the presidency. And I think that was his choice. He decided that he would stay inside. It could be more effective and work at the issues from there. As to the situation now, my impression from the chats we had with him is that he believes that the good people will win that battle inside the ANC. He's obviously very close to Cyril and works, and he believes that they are making progress in that regard. I know it's a very difficult situation to stomach when there is all this PPE corruption. But if you asked him directly, are we making progress in the right direction, he would say yes.
So Chris, does he believe that this idea, really supported and enunciated by President Cyril Ramaphosa again yesterday on the campaign trail, that the renewal of the ANC, its putting right, is succeeding and can be done, even though we've seen 4 new big scandals added in the past 3 years? Does he think that it can still be saved and work for the good of the country?
Yeah, I have to make assumptions here, but
Yes.
The fact that he's still sitting inside the ANC would suggest that he does. And I'm sure he, like all of us, has been very, very disappointed by those terrible setbacks. For example, the PPE corruption. But as I said, I do think he would, if you had to ask him directly, he would say yes. We've got the shoulder to the wheel, and it's moving forward.
I just want to greet Professor Jairam Reddy. Good to have you on here. Krish Govender telling us that it was substantial consensus, I think. And just a few more people who have joined us. Dawn King, Tometsana Kiba from Pretoria. Somebody asked us why we don't have Pravin Gordhan on here. I think that we did try, and we will certainly try again. Dudley Roswell, and just to tell everybody that the book Joining the Dots is available in the DM bookstore. So, Jonathan, if I may come to you and talk about the work that Pravin Gordhan is doing now. So, in many ways, he was placed at Public Enterprises, and from my sitting and covering the Zondo Commission for all the years, that really was where the worst state capture happened. It's where the greatest extraction happened from Eskom, Transnet, Denel. So now he's put in there as the great fixer. How is that going in your view?
Well, I think I'm going to pass this question
to Chris. Is it a Chris question? That's fine. Please take it up. Yeah? No problems.
Geez, sorry, I was slightly distracted by reading the questions there.
No problem. I'll tell you again. So now Pravin Gordhan is Minister of Public Enterprises.
Yes.
Our SOEs were really decimated by capture. That's where the most money was stolen from, where the worst people were put into, and now he's the guy who has to fix that up. And I'm just wondering how that's going in your interviews with him. What did you learn?
Okay, he was very guarded, and I think the reason for that is that he's got constituencies that have very different perspectives on that. For example, the business constituency and on the other hand, the labor movement. Both of them have very strong sentiments about SOEs. So broadly speaking, so we had to speak to staff around him and get a sense and try and develop an idea of what we believed he was trying to get up to. And one of the people that he quoted was Mariana Mazzucato, an economist.
Yes.
Who's a professor at the University College in London. And her issue of the state's role in the economy, she says, is a different notion of the state, not just a market fixer, but also a market co-creator and shaper. And I think that's the way he's moving with the SOEs. I think we're going to see far, far fewer SOEs in South Africa very soon. But the ones that remain will be those that the government believes have a strategic role to play in developing and the economy. And there will be partnerships, as there has been with SAA. There will be partnerships between the state and private enterprise in some of them. So typically similar to the Swedish model. And yes, I think, as you say, it's everybody who we chatted to about it said it's probably the most difficult role in government today. It's like a really tough one. But he is attacking it with his classic, this typical diligence that he has. And I think in time, this is really one of those that we're going to have to look back in a few years and see how well he did. But I think that progress is starting to be made.
Thank you. So quite a few questions on why on earth did he keep SAA? Why not let it crash or sell it? But what in fact has happened is a very interesting deal, and now it's back in the sky. Is that typically what you're saying? Is that the direction where we're headed in? Quite pragmatic. The state still keeps, I think, the majority share, but will you see that at the ports? Will you see it at Transnet? Is this a model in your discussions with him?
Yes, I do think that you will see that as a classic model. I mean, during one of our conversations, he talked about the Swedish model, and they have, for example, an oil company that's half state-owned, half private. So I think that's one part of it. But I don't think they are going to apply one blueprint and say this is how it must work. I think the broad overview will be what is strategically important for South Africa that we need to sustain, which the private sector won't. And then for the rest, I think they'll just get rid of a lot of them.
That's really interesting insights. Thank you. I'm not sure who this one is for, but I'll ask it. So when I watched Pravin Gordhan doing his evidence at the Zondo Commission, it was perhaps one of the more frightening weeks, because the EFF chose that week to come and protest outside, which began their long-standing opposition to the commission. But it was also, I think, the height of the attacks against him, both online, where there was severe disinformation, but also against his person. And I must say, he really looked riled that day, because his family was there with him, and it felt like quite dangerous to go out of there. When a few journalists and I when we went out to cover what was happening outside, that was perhaps one of a few times in my country where I felt endangered as a journalist, because we got attacked from the platform by Julius Malema. How has this period of growing race rhetoric, anti-Indian rhetoric against him, becoming the target almost of the RET movement and of the EFF, how has that impacted him? Did that come up at all in your discussions?
When we spoke to him directly about it, I think he was quite saying, well, it comes with the territory. I don't like it. I don't like being sworn at, but I can manage it. But when we spoke to other people around it, it seemed that it had much more of an impact than that on him. I think his contribution historically, and the fact that he was called a racist, I think it hurts him. And I think, people said to us that during that period, his health really suffered. So I think that he's quite stoic about it. But my feeling is that it had quite a huge physical impact on him.
This is quite a big question here. If I may just read you some of the Simon van Dranen asking us, why is the EFF particularly Julius Malema so anti-PG? Is it because they believe he's anti-black, or is it more because they are concerned about his capitalist leanings and what might come out of his dealings with what happened of the SOEs during the Zuma era? Why is PG disliked so much by the EFF? That's from Kevin Lodge.
It's a question that we did ponder, Ferial, at some length, and we wrote about it.
Yes.
And we quoted a lot of people who have their own theories. Most of them believe that it was his access to information effectively as the commissioner of SARS and as the finance minister. He knows stuff that they don't want to get out. And the other thing is that he's avowedly anti-corruption. And just about all these people who attack him so vigorously have been associated with corruption in some way or other. And so he's not going to roll over and be quiet about corruption. And that's what they want. So I think there's the two elements to that.
Interestingly,
And
we
yes.
did contact the EFF. We did contact other foes of his, asking them to sort of, we wanted to interrogate the evidence that they've got and to speak to them about it. They didn't respond. So, which
so the EFF didn't respond to your request to understand their view of him.
Yeah,
that's interesting. You go in some length into trying to deeply understand this common insult that he's the head of this Indian cabal. Where did that come from? I found that quite fascinating, and people enjoyed reading about that in the extract on the DM.
Yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon. We found in archives, the O'Malley archives, who has interviewed literally hundreds of South Africans about the transition, and we found.
Just tell us about O'Malley, because he's such a fascinating chap. Yeah?
He wrote a biography of Mac Maraj, and he's an Irishman who's just was fascinated by South Africa. And there are literally, I think there's something like 900 transcripts of interviews in those archives. If anybody wants to sort of get a sense of South Africa, particularly during the transition and around the transition, that's a very good place to go. But as far as the Indian Cabal is concerned, Floyd Shivambu found a document in those archives which appears to be an ANC commission of inquiry, perhaps, or an inquiry into the so-called Indian Cabal, but it's incomplete, and Mac Maraj has dismissed it as being rubbish. And then, so what we did is we interrogated where might this issue have come from. And there's a whole bunch of reasons, like, for example, that PG is a forceful personality. I think he doesn't suffer fools, and probably quite impatient. So I think, some people resented that. And so these things sort of played into a narrative that suggested he was head of a little secret cabal somewhere. And the other issue was during the struggle times, obviously they had to keep a lot of information to themselves. You couldn't go and have a sort of town hall meeting to discuss strategy. And I think some people felt he wasn't sharing stuff enough at that time as a consequence of that.
It was interesting the way he explained that. Can you share that, Chris?
Yeah. We asked him straight out, what is this issue of the cabal? And he said, well, the two people talking to me on Zoom here are Jonathan and Christopher, and you both are trying to, hypothetically, obviously, you want to be chairman of the soccer club. Jonathan has his people who support him. Chris has his people who support him. So there's two cabals, in effect, two cabals. And he, obviously using that as an example, I think he believes that's part of how the allegation came about.
So I must say, I just want to offer some insight here, is that, whose phone is that?
It's not mine.
Oh, shit. That's probably mine, which is...
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was a nice musical interlude. So I wanted to offer some insight into when I think that relationship between Julius Malema and Pravin Gordhan started going off track. Remember that he was the minister in charge of stopping the ANC Youth League's business dealings in Limpopo with the roads and so on. So it's a very long-standing enmity that expresses itself
Yeah.
right until today. So, Chris, I thought you might read for us a little bit about a passage from the book that you'd like to share.
Okay, I'm going to read the start of chapter 5, which is called Captured by the State.
Thank you.
And it takes us back some 30 years or so. By Durban standards, it was a cold day on 12 July 1990 when Pravin Gordhan pulled up outside a block of flats in Whitfield Road in the suburb of Overport. He was there to meet Amnesh Sankar, who, with Gordhan, had been chosen to be part of Operation Vula. The Brickfield Road flat was being used both as a residence for a colleague who'd entered the country for the operation and as an administration centre. Gordhan, in short sleeves in spite of the weather, parked his car in the basement and walked up the 2 flights of stairs to the flat. He put the key in the lock and opened the door. The next second, he was looking down the barrel of a handgun. Pointing it at Gordhan's head was an officer from the notorious security branch in Durban. Operation Vula had been exposed. There was, of course, intense secrecy around Operation Vula in 1988, when Maharaj and Safiwe Nyanda were sent into the country on a clandestine mission by the ANC's leadership in exile. Gordhan himself had been scheduled to pick up Maharaj from the Swaziland border, but there'd been a communication mix-up, and Gordhan had gone to the Zimbabwean border. Maharaj got a taxi to Johannesburg and was driven from there to Durban by Ismail Mamoniat. There was a knock on my house door, which very few people knew about, and lo and behold, it was Mac, says Gordhan. Many of those involved still point to Maharaj when asked to elaborate on the aims of the operation, saying he held his cards close to his chest and drip-fed information only when absolutely necessary. Underground operators at the time worked on a strict need-to-know basis. This didn't always go down with his comrades. Billy Nair was a venerated struggle activist with many years of experience who'd been imprisoned for 20 years on Robben Island. He was one of the first people Maharaj looked up after sneaking into the country via Swaziland. The first night I was alone with Billy, he suggested we take a drive at about 11 at night, and we drove down to the Durban beachfront, Maharaj recalls. And he drove me past Sia Swat, the police station where the security branch offices in Durban were located, and the lights were on the 11th floor. And Billy said, "Now you see, that's the place where we get tortured. Now it's time we bomb this fucking place." And I said to him, "We're not doing it." So we went back to my hideout, and we had a Mursa argument. I couldn't disclose, even to Billy, the nature of my mission. He thought I was there to carry out MK activity, and he was getting furious that I wasn't agreeing. As he and Maharaj sipped on whiskey, Nair asked, "What are you doing here if you can't take orders from us?" "Who the hell are you guys to give me orders?" responded Maharaj. "Well, we are the UDF," said Nair. "Well, you fuck off. You don't give me orders," Maharaj shouted. Nair had come to Maharaj's hideout with a cap pulled low over his face and a walking stick. He put on his cap, grabbed the stick, and stormed out, swearing black and blue, says Maharaj. Nyanda, who by that time had joined them in the safe house, was, according to Maharaj, shocked at the ferocity of the argument between 2 senior comrades. Maharaj was due to leave for Johannesburg the next day at 5 a.m., but decided that he should first set things straight with Nair. I wrote a note apologizing to Billy. "Put aside this argument. We're in one struggle, blah, blah, blah." Maharaj went to Nyanda's bedroom with the note in a sealed envelope and asked him to give it to Nair, who at 7 the next morning was knocking on the door of the safe house, despite not being supposed to visit it during daylight hours. Sapiwe gets up, opens the door. Billy doesn't even greet Sapiwe. He marches to my bedroom, and he finds my bed made, and I'm gone. "Where's this guy? Why is he gone?" Nair asked. "You know, he was heading for Joburg. He left at 5, responded Nyanda. "Oh shit," said Nair. "I've come to say sorry. He left an envelope here for you." Maharaj finishes the story laughing. He, Nair, opens the envelope. He reads it where I'm saying sorry. He says, "I withdraw my sorry, as long as it's clear that he apologized first."
That's a lovely, thank you very much. Just to say also, Jonathan, for the phone ringing, somebody noted that was the Cabal calling. So, Operation Vula, quite a big part and not a very well-known part of Pravin Gordhan's history. Just to remind our audience, what was Operation Vula?
It, in effect, was to align the external struggle with the external strategy and tactics with those people on the ground in South Africa. So they brought in Mac and Siphiwe and Nyanda to liaise and work alongside people like Pravin and get them all on the same page. The one big concern at the time was of the external leadership was that there was a big focus on armed struggle inside and not enough of a focus on mass mobilization. So that was one aspect of it that needed to be aligned.
That's really so. What was really interesting in the book as well that I didn't know was quite how deep the enmity ran between Mo Sheikh's unit in KZN and Pravin Gordhan's theories of mass mobilization and getting people on side of the struggle at the time. Either of you want to share a little bit of that with us?
Yeah, they both spoke about it very frankly, and they've subsequently, overcome it and become very close. But
yes.
At the time, Mo he thought this mass mobilization would take too long. Let's go the armed route. And Pravin saw mass mobilization as the strategy, building up a base that you could carry along with you when you confront the state. So they both had very different approaches, and there was quite some enmity between the two of them.
But they did work together at some point in Operation Vula. Yeah.
And so when I was reading that, I thought, wow, so he's a process guy. He takes a while to fix things. The fix at SARS took quite a time. But we have an urgency of change right now. And I think a fair criticism of the Ramaphosa administration, of which Pravin Gordhan at first played almost a prime minister type role, is that it's very, very slow. Do you think he is slowing down the pace of reform because he's that guy who waits for buy-in, who believes in process, who wants to get it all right before you move, where you can make perfection the enemy of the good?
Yeah, I think he may well be playing that role. I don't know. We don't know, and it's not something we've interrogated in the book. But just off the top of my head, and having talked to him and studied the way he works, he won't rush in and make decisions. So you might be right. Maybe he is being cautious, and maybe it's having an influence on processes in government. One thing I do know about him is that he's a lot of the criticism directed at him is like water off a duck's back. So he wouldn't worry about that. If he has an objective in mind and know how he's going to get there, he will pursue it in spite of what people are saying.
Thank you. I just want to read some thoughts here from Norman Skoonies. He says the reason CR and PG stayed within the ANC during the JZ state capture era is because they correctly believe they could get more information out that way and be more impactful. That was Ramaphosa's view at the commission as well. Leaving the ANC would have meant they would have been happily replaced by JZ's cronies. Do you agree with that strategy employed by both men, to fight inside, whereas if you had gone out, you'd have just been left like two voices in the wilderness?
Yeah, I do personally. I think they... if they'd moved out, if they'd left the ANC, and it was obviously a discussion that he'd had at some stage, but if he'd left the ANC, I think the power base that he had would have been completely voided.
That's interesting. So I want to come to, as we begin to wind up, is I get the sense that of somebody who was invulnerable and almost unknowable, because what the book doesn't give me is a deeper sense of the individual, that he didn't quite let you in. is he such like, is that just, does he build a big carapace around himself? And then just a question, if you could answer, from Ingrid Lewin, why is there no mention in the book of Pravin's first wife, Pravina, who was also severely harassed by the security police when he was in detention in the 80s? Do you feel you got under the skin of this person? Or is what you see what you get? Huh?
We do devote an entire chapter to trying to flesh out who is Pravin Gordhan. He's a very enigmatic man, and I think he's very, very private. We found out from his wife that he will sob when he's watching something on TV, but you would never see that publicly. You'll never see that part of him. So we have tried to extrapolate from what people have told us and what we've gathered ourselves. We've tried to extrapolate, this is Pravin Gordhan. And I mean, the elements of it that are fascinating is like, he's a real, obviously a taskmaster at work, and he expects people to really go the extra mile. And he's very intolerant of people trying to take shortcuts or who don't prepare thoroughly. But also, people told us he's actually a very warm person, and if you have an issue or you're having trouble with your family, he will go, he will do special things for you. He will, and if it's a staff member, he will let them off work or tell them to just go home now. So, I don't think you are ever going to get to know him very well if you don't live with him. But I think we, as far as we could, we have tried to interrogate the range of his personality.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, I think so. I think I definitely had a much better understanding of him. When we first embarked on this project, I knew what was in the public domain, and that actually wasn't a lot. There isn't very much about his background, about the type of person he is, about his involvement in the struggle years, and so I found that fascinating, and I think that does paint a picture of him. But I think he as Chris says, he doesn't allow people, or too many people, to get too close to him, and he is very private. And just in relation to that question about his first wife,
yes,
we decided not to sort of go into his personal life that much. It was a particular book. It's a book about where he comes from, what makes him tick, and his involvement, what formed his political consciousness. So we didn't decide to delve into the kind of the more personal aspect of his life. Yeah.
Thank you. I must say, the only time, please, Chris, yes.
Sorry, I was just going to say that in the question about the reference to his first wife, we wouldn't have even dealt with his second wife. Our approach was that his private life is private, but it just so happened as the story evolved that one of his confidants recommended to us that we speak to her for insights about him, and she eventually agreed. So, that's why we interviewed her and not the first wife.
Thank you for that. I suppose for me is that when you do get a sense of the person, they become more relatable and almost interesting when you can get to know the private side of this very public figure. And the only time I've seen that is on that morning after Pravin Gordhan was axed, and we all went to the treasury and people forming a chain around it to protect it. And then inside, he and Tabisi Jonah spoke to their staff for the last time, a very touching day. And then afterwards, his family went with him to go and pack up his office, and all they came out with, I remember, was a few small boxes, and you could see the absolute concern for him from Vani, his wife, from his daughter was with him, and I think a nephew who was also with. And that was interesting to me to see that this had really shaken him. So now a final question from Veronica Mputing, and it goes right to the title of the book, Joining the Dots. It's the main thing people know about him now, is the main phrase associated with him. Before it may have been mass mobilization, higher purpose, sufficient consensus. So PG gave new meaning to join the dots when he asked South Africans to do so. And many dots there are. South Africans in the world have been exposed to widespread corruption and malfeasance, which is overwhelming, and it's battered us in its breadth and depth in our society. In addition to exercising our votes at the ballot box, how can South Africans play our part in correcting the ANC and those amongst us with corrupt and ignoble tendencies? Does the book provide insight into that? And either of you, just to remind us where that now famous phrase first made itself heard.
Jonathan?
Well, the famous phrase was after, in fact, it was that week. It was a very dramatic week after that prologue where that I read, where he arrived back in South Africa, and there was all this talk about him being fired. And in that week, Ahmed Kathrada died, and it was there was the whole momentum around the Zuma must fall campaign, and all the state capture and the corruption and the Guptas. It was building. And at one of the memorials, he made a speech. I think it was at the memorial in Johannesburg, where he told South Africans to join connect the dots. And I think that's where the phrase came from. And he was basically saying, look at who is behind this corruption. How can we play a role in correcting the ANC? I suppose it's to do maybe what Pravin has dedicated his life to doing, and that's to being honest ourselves and to standing up and to not sort of allowing corruption to take root. To be civic minded.
I think
Ferial, Chris,
if there's a lesson in the exercise that Jonathan and I undertook and writing this book, and all the people we spoke to, if there's a lesson for other South Africans in it, it would be become an activist, be an activist in some way or other, even if it's a small community level. You can make a difference.
That's great. So from Krish Govender, PG is an activist working in a dishonest and dangerous environment. Franz Gebhardt, remembering how moving the memorial of Ahmed Kathrada was. I'll never forget the speech of PG at St. George's Cathedral. And then lastly I've just lost that one. Many people saying thank you. Quite a few have already read the book. We are out of time. Very good luck. Congratulations on the book, both of you. Joining the Dots is available in the DM bookshop. Very good luck with it. And I hope perhaps there'll be a happy story, second follow-up, or perhaps an end chapter where we finally know the Dots. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming.